Greetings, Animating Rebel. I wanted to go ahead and address your concerns or objections against property dualism. The first major problem with your critique is that you don't even understand what emergence is. You think emergent things are simply the sum of their parts. That is exactly what emergence is not. Why you couldn't get this correct is hard to understand, since it would have only taken a few minutes of research to find out what emergence is. From Wikipedia, a property of a system is said to be emergent if it is in some sense more than the sum of the properties of the system's parts. From the Journal of the Operational Research Society, the idea of emergent property is central to systems thinking. It is otherwise expressed as the whole is more than the sum of its parts, where whole equates to emergent property. And from IEET, emergentism. A property of a system is said to be emergent if it is more than the sum of the properties of the system's parts. Your analogy was also exceedingly myopic. While it is true that if you configured a bunch of blue Legos together, you are not going to end up with an emergent figure which is red in color, it takes frighteningly little imagination to realize that if you configured a bunch of Legos together, you could end up with an emergent figure that is not just a bunch of Legos, which would thus be an example of an emergent property, a novelty of the system that is more than the sum of its parts. Prior to arrangement, the sum of the parts is just a bunch of Lego blocks, but arranged and configured in the proper way, and the novel feature of a car emerges. Same with the color situation. It takes little knowledge to know that mixing blue and yellow gives you the novel emergent color of green. Mixing red and green gives you the novel emergent color of brown. The underlying properties, when arranged or configured in a certain way, facilitates the emergence of a property that is new and thus more than the parts involved. In your second video that contains your further objections or concerns, you again reveal your erroneous understanding of emergence. You give us a definition of emergence that is correct, then claim erroneously that emergence simply does not work that way, when that is exactly how, or one of the ways, emergence can work. Then from there you fallaciously beg the question by claiming that such a situation would be akin to a miracle and that the mind would essentially have to come from nothing. You don't prove or argue for any of that, you simply assume it, which is question begging. It's interesting, Animating Rebel, that you said it should be pretty obvious that when you start out with basic parts, you're going to end up with those basic parts. You aren't magically going to bring about an ontologically distinct entity or property. That's interesting because it's weird how you seem not to realize that emergence is a proven fact of reality, and that is the reason emergent property dualism is the best and correct understanding of the mind-body relation. Because its fundamental dynamic is empirically verified in nature. Unlike substance dualism, which is not empirically verified and has the fatal interaction problem, and idealism, which is arguably total nonsense. As we learn from Peter Tyson and PBS, quote, "It's not magic," the physicist Doane Farmer once said about emergence, "but it feels like magic. Birds, atmospheric disturbances, and city dwellers self-organize, giving rise to flocks, hurricanes, and distinct neighborhoods. Such entirely new properties and behaviors emerge with no one directing and no one able to foresee the new characteristics from knowledge of the constituents alone. The whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts. In the following 10 examples, see how emergence pervades the world around us." Unquote. The key thing in that passage is emergence pervades the world around us. Emergence is a verified fact of reality. At around 226 of your video, AR, you commit another question-begging fallacy, as you don't give any substantiation for why, in order for intentional states to causally interact with the physical, they have to be explained in terms of materialistic functionalism. This is also very bizarre thinking from you. Why would you think a person who is a property dualist would need to explain things by way of a different account/model of the mind-body relation, which is functionalism, is anyone's guess. In answer to your first question, we can understand that the mind is strongly emergent because the mind emerges from the brain, but a complete account of it would not be possible at lower levels of explanation, which makes it irreducible. Another popular understanding is that if the system is not able to be simulated, it's strongly emergent. And to answer your second question, which will resolve your dilemma, you ask, how would I defend the notion that intentional states have causal efficacy under property dualism? If intentional states are ontologically distinct from physical states, then how can they causally interact with physical states? The answer is that they can interact with each other because they have a nexus of interaction, which is the brain. This is the reason why substance dualism has an interaction problem. There is no nexus of interaction because they are not just ontologically distinct, but also wholly independent of one another, since they are both supposed to be entities. But with property dualism, you don't have two entities that are ontologically different. You have one entity and a property that is caused by that. So while there is an ontological distinction, they are not independent of one another and are causally connected. So while there is an ontological distinction, there is no causal distinction. Having this causal connection allows the invocation of Jaegwon Kim's causal inheritance principle, whereby the supervenient property, the mind, inherits the causal powers of the subvening base, the brain, which then allows for what is known as downward causation. A rough but excellent analogy of the causal inheritance principle can be seen with cold water in a pot sitting on a stove. The water, which is supervening on the stove, shares a nexus of interaction with the stove via the pot. Due to this connection, the heat from the stove can be inherited by the supervening phenomena, thereby allowing the water to become hot as well, thus borrowing or inheriting the powers of the subvening base.